Good morning, good morning, good morning. My name is Creed Hendrickson, and today we will be discussing an article entitled Snap Culture, a Different Kind of Reading. The author was Patrick Johnson, and this was produced in 1995. Now, this study specifically is oriented around, or focused rather, on snapping as a communicative form of African American communication. Specifically, this study looks at homosexual African American men. This study looks not only intracultural within that specific society and that specific community, but also interculturally, what happens whenever snapping has been taken and used by another community or society. This study was done through 3 different methods. The first one was done through observation. These observations were done in 2 different states, one in central North Carolina that was done at a university there that was not named, as well as a small shopping center that wasn't named either. The other area of observation was in southern Louisiana. It was done at a university there that wasn't named, but also at a small gay nightclub that was down there. This observations allowed them to see different kinds of interactions in society, specifically with homosexual African American men. Now, the second method I would use was a set of interviews that was done on 9 different people. These 9 different people varied from 40-year-olds to early 20s to male to female, heterosexual to homosexual, African American to Caucasian. So there was lots of different varieties, trying to get a broad perspective on everything that was going on. These interviews were just a different set of questions of how they interacted with people as a whole, but also specifically what they saw snapping as. Snapping is defined just as simply your middle finger and your thumb, and then just pressing down and popping like that. That's how you define it. Work forward. The third different method was media analysis. He used 10 different television shows as well as documentaries, and he analyzed them for what they were trying to portray, not just snapping, but also what snapping implied as a whole. Some of these were entitled Tongues United, Martin, In Living Color, and The Colored Museum. I've only seen In Living Color, but that doesn't really have any praise on that. He had a whole host of different discoveries that really, they seemed varied when I was reading it, but they all seemed to tie back, obviously, to African American culture. And the first thing he discovered was the origin of snapping in African American culture. It happened in Africa. Mothers would tell their children about the story of the signifying monkey. The signifying monkey was someone who hung around with the king of the jungle or the lion. And when he hung around him, he would oftentimes be mischievous or playful or make fun of somebody. And when he did that, he would emphasize it by snapping at different times. He would snap and snap. So when the mother told the children began to adopt that. And as slowly as African culture came over here, that became adopted over here. So that was really the origin of snapping. Now, nonverbal, or snapping is a nonverbal communicative form. Specifically, it's a signifier. And so it has 2 different forms that it comes in, specifically in the homosexual African American culture. The first one being reading. So we often might use reading really as calling somebody out. They also have the phrase cracking someone's face. So the idea is you split their face down the middle and open up and reveal what's on the inside. So when you read somebody, you read it and then you call out a characteristic about that. And that is emphasized when you snap and bring it about. Say something, snap. The other one is an inverse of that. It's called throwing shade. Now, throwing shade does not have any nonverbal nonverbal snapping rather. You just turn and don't even face the person. That's also sometimes a worse insult because you're not even willing to acknowledge that the person is there. So it doesn't have anything with snapping, but he said this is an inverse to snapping. Another particular thing is that he discovered that there is a queen culture within homosexual African American men and how snapping is used in that culture. So queen is defined in this study as a phrase he uses, a flamboyant homosexual. Now, the reason that they're identified as a flamboyant homosexual in the queen culture because of snapping is because, as we talked about earlier, it's the women who use snapping in the storytelling. And that is what they want to identify. They want to identify as having some feminine characteristics when they snap. So when people see them snap, they think, oh, the only other people that we see snapping in the African American culture are the women. So that's the idea. Those are the attributes that they're trying to draw upon and use and get people to identify them as well. Another culture or atmosphere within African American was this homosexual African American was this family atmosphere. Now, family is used in the sense of anyone that is homosexual, whether they're out or still in the closet. That's how Johnson was using it. So anyone that is in the family, they will use snapping typically to be supportive. So some phrases that they've said is they'll say, work girl, work boy, work, work, or they'll say, tear it up, or wig is beat, and they'll use snapping on each and every one of those to emphasize and to show support. sometimes they'll use snapping to help identify other homosexual men. So Johnson was going into a mall with one of his homosexual African-American men in North Carolina, and another African-American was walking out. Johnson's friend snapped at the other guy. They both made eye contact and nodded at each other. And Johnson said, well, what was that about? He said, oh, well, he looked homosexual to me, so I snapped at him and made eye contact, and we both acknowledged that, and that means that we're both gay. We both know that. He said, it was interesting that snapping is used as this. Snapping is also used in a playful way known as playground setting. So the playground is really any open atmosphere, and playground is really a competition between homosexual African-American men, and that they try to, as I talked about earlier, when they were reading, you try to call somebody out about their character, and the winner is really determined by the crowd's reaction, who reacts the loudest. And so you may have a phrase where you diss somebody and you snap to add on to it. You may snap at the beginning and snap at the end. You may double snap in the middle to add emphasis. There's just different ways. And again, the crowd determines the winner as a whole. So those are all intracultural. Those are all within the African American society. But snapping has begun to come out to the Caucasian society as well. And Johnson defined them as whippersnappers. Homosexual Caucasian whippersnappers is the phrase that he used. And so they began to see that homosexual African-American men use snapping as a distinguisher that they are homosexual, so Caucasian men began to use that as well. The only one that was actually similar was the Queen Society, but the Playground Society was a little bit different, and the Family Society or culture was a little bit different. He didn't really explain why, but he said those are different. The only one that is similar really is the Playground one, or the Queen one rather, as a whole. He also began to identify in the observations and media analysis and the interviews that heterosexuals use snapping too, but they use it in a derogatory way. If they're using it specifically oriented to homosexuality in some way, homosexuals are extremely offended by that because they are identifying with something that they are not actually a part of. Now obviously heterosexual men use snapping in different ways, and that's not what they're really talking about. They're trying to say that's when it's used in a derogatory way. It's very offensive to homosexuals. The three different ideas that were really related back to the textbook, the first one being kinesics. So kinesics is really any type of nonverbal communication, or it's a specific one. And the textbook talked about Richard Nixon when he used A-OK over here. It was fine, but when we went to Venezuela and used A-OK in this form, it caused legitimate riots in the streets because it was known as the middle finger, pretty much is our equivalent for it. So that is similar to what is happening whenever homosexual African-American men use snapping, but then heterosexual men use it, or maybe some homosexual Caucasian men use it, and there's this misunderstanding because one person understands it as something, but the other doesn't really understand it, and there's this difficulty going back and forth. Snaps are also meant to be used as gestalts. So gestalts are ideas where it needs to be a compilation, so it needs to be vocalics, as well as your haptics, as well as some types of kinesics. It's a compilation. So snap should not be taken simply for a snap, but rather as an emphasis on what you're trying to say and how you're using it. The third relevance that I found in the textbook was that one of the studies that was done is that women are likely to gesture more. So whenever homosexual men want to be identified with effeminate or feminine attributes about themselves, they will snap more to begin to identify themselves and try to bring that, that interpretation or impression to other people. So those are the three things that I found relevant back to the textbook. Any questions?
When was the study done?
When or where?
When?
1995, so this findings are 22 years old.
Wow. How about the vipers?
No, this is an older one.
Did you say whippersnapper?
Whippersnapper. A whippersnapper is homosexual Caucasian, that is the phrase he used. And that was, he said he found that through the interviews, through the media analysis, and the observations is the phrases.
Did he say what it meant?
He didn't really say what it meant. He just said whippersnapper, and then continued to talk about how it's the same in the Queen, but different in the playground and the family settings. Okay.
So why did you choose this article? What caught your eye about it? Because like, did you
I
know about it?
No, I didn't really know. I didn't know the origin. I saw snap culture and I read it and you're like, I don't really know much about snap culture or homosexuality in this area. And I thought it would just be interesting as a whole to learn more about it. I love to learn random things.
So like, you would just go like that?
Yeah, with an emphasis when you're saying a phrase. So the phrases that they said earlier was work girl, work, or work boy, work. It said work. You can do it at different times depending on how you like to emphasize or what you're trying to emphasize. Or they said wig it, I think is another way of saying you wear that well. This is again in 1995. William.
Also,
Oh.
whippersnapper. Well, I just okay.
Not really sure on the origin of that. He didn't really go into detail about it.
Did the study touch on any other forms of snapping, such as rat
No,
snapping?
sadly he did not.
With the pointer finger instead of the middle?
No, he specifically defined only this one as the middle finger and the thumb. I'm sorry?
Was there anything about their use of facial expressions with the snapping?
No, there wasn't specifically. He only really put phrases in there. He didn't even really talk about vocabs because that would have opened up a whole new can of worms. He only talked about snapping, and not even when they use it, just simply that they use it with the phrase. He said they may use it at the beginning or the end or the middle, but he didn't really talk about typically where they put the snapping emphasis.
Do you think that with the 22-year difference between now and when this was released, that a new study is merited? And that
Yes, absolutely, yes. And snapping is completely, it's not interpreted in that way, stereotypically. Now, there may be obviously cases that have carried over, but I'd say it's much different today.
Now, were you saying that snapping originated in Africa, or were you saying that's just how it got to America?
This specific, I was talking about specifically within the African American community, not as a whole, as in that's where it came from, was the story of the signifying monkey.
Gotcha.
I was giggling at that. I was just giggling at how you said it.
Was that given in the article, or is that your own personal research?
No, I was given an article. Yeah, this is one of the first discoveries was that is the origin of it.
monk.
It was very interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you.